Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Gerard Toal, and this is a lecture in my course, Topics in Political Geography. It's a graduate level course that I'm offering at Virginia Tech in the spring of 2017. In this lecture, I want to examine Patrick Porter's book, The Global Village Myth. And I wanted to say a little bit about technology, security, and distance. Now, I like Porter's book, and I think it's really quite useful. But I want to argue that it is better reconceptualized within the framework of critical geopolitics, which he misunderstands and gives short shrift to in his analysis. So let me remind you again of the core building blocks of critical geopolitics: understanding the geopolitical field, the geopolitical condition, which is a sort of techno-territorial, communicational condition, and then geopolitical culture. Now, Porter's book addresses all of this, and he addresses in part the geopolitical culture, which is globalism. It is the discourse of liberal hegemony. It's the discourse of liberal messianic visions of United States and Great Britain, Tony Blair, George W. Bush, and so on and so forth. And he's British himself. He's a reader in political science in Reading, and so he's coming out of that whole experience and reacting to it. He's addressing a geopolitical field that seems like it is global. And of course wants to push back against that. And he's also addressing geopolitical conditions. So all of these things are mixed up together in his work. And so what I want to do is I want to point you to some of the ways in which the book is very, very useful for us in thinking through questions concerning geopolitics in the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. So the problematic that the book addresses is globalization. It's a problematic that the whole notion of globalization, of course, was one that was very prominent at the end of the Cold War. It's sort of the Cold War ended, and what comes next? Globalization. But the actual, if you look at the history of the term globalization, it goes back to the 1960s. It was discussed in the 1970s, but it's in the 1980s and late 80s and early 90s that it really takes off as a notion. And I want to draw your attention to some books that sought to theorize what was happening at this particular time. So Kenichi Ome's book, The Borderless World, that came out in 1990, just before the first Gulf War. And he's a management consultant at McKinsey, and he makes this argument about how the future is one of borderlessness, of interconnectedness between different states. And of course that then was quickly followed by the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and that argument did not seem, which suggested that geoeconomics or economics was replacing geopolitics, and it got short shrift for a few years, but then came back. And so that was one articulation. There were other articulations from this time, and I wrote about this particular phenomenon in a series of different essays in the 1990s myself, about the vision of deterritorialization, the idea of us coming into an era of frictionless geography, how computers and information technology and communications and the sort of blending of all of these together were creating something new. There's a certain breathless universalism in the discourse that I and others were pushing back against, in the name of saying that, actually geography is about material things and there's lots and lots of frictions left. But this was a discourse which nevertheless captured the imagination of the public in the West or in affluent areas. And it was also reflective of the particular culture of emphasis on the spectacular, an emphasis on dramatic universals. In one sense, these titles sold books. They sold newspapers when there still were newspapers and magazines. And they seemed as if they were, quote unquote, the next thing. I've arranged these books here in order of their publication. So Ome's book comes out in 1990. Then you have the Spanish sociologist who sought to synthesize all of this particular work. His previous work was on the Information Society, and he wrote a trilogy of books in the mid-1990s, beginning with the Rise of the Network Society in 1996, and then followed by two others, all part of the trilogy which he called the Information Age. And these books were written really quite quickly. They were subsequently revised and are better as revisions. But there's also a breathless quality to it too. So the idea of the space of flows is a notion that was coined by Castells, and he in part has a certain critical distance from this particular discourse, but only a degree of critical distance from it. He's also swept up in it too, and its particular the vision of dramatic transformation by technological change. Another book by an economist writer, The Death of Distance, which did okay as a pop book, as a trade book, but it was not one that had any real impact in academia at all. And then lastly, Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. And Friedman is a kind of classic exponent of these the what comes next genre of writing, and he's a very skilled writer, but his work is also extremely glib in lots of ways, and caught up in the particular geopolitical culture that it seeks to constitute what comes next, and in so doing, there's a certain bubble-like quality to his writings. Now, there's also a dimension which has to do with technological change in warfare. So when I talk about the geopolitical condition, I emphasize communications, transportation, but also military technology. And the Revolution in Military Affairs, RMA, was a major concern in the late 70s and 1980s. And again, it was sort of, how is technology changing how war is fought? And there's also a breathless quality to this particular discourse, as well as a political economy to sell technological weapons to the Pentagon. It was really quite successful. The Gulf War, the first Gulf War, was the so-called first remote controlled war, even though it wasn't necessarily. There's also aspects of technological transformations going on in Vietnam too, with the electronic frontier and so on and so forth. But what's interesting about this discourse in the 1980s and the 1990s in the United States is that it expresses a certain technological sublime, technological fundamentalism, that technology is going to change everything. But there's also very clearly an attentiveness to affect. So the shock and awe doctrine of acquiring rapid dominance is about what do these technologies do to how people perceive and how they understand. So it's about breaking the will of the enemy, and in many instances that's through these spectacular displays. And in and of itself, of course, that has a lot of hubris associated with it, but it was and remains a very important tendency, and is something that we need to have sort of critical distance on if we're to understand this particular complex of a geopolitical condition, the geopolitical field, and geopolitical culture. Clearly, one part of this is about a technological utopia, but there's also very clearly threat discourses coming out, and this is where the end of the Cold War created space for these new discourses, because a territorial enemy, a Soviet bloc, clearly identifiable on the map, was gone. And therefore, what comes next? Well, what comes next is the backlash against globalization, or what comes next is the non-integrating periphery that needs to be integrated, or it needs to be controlled and walled off from the integrating core, to use the terms of Thomas Barnett in his book, The Pentagon's New Map. Thomas Friedman's book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, creates this binary between the Lexus being something which is fast and luxurious, and the olive tree being a kind of primordial attachment to territory and to ground and to blood and so on and so forth. Benjamin Barber gives us a more sophisticated analysis of this by looking at the contrast between jihad, or sort of a call to fundamentalism, and Macworld, which is what globalization is creating. Importantly, it is important to grasp the so-called backlash against globalization, fundamentalism, is in and of itself created by modern technologies and enabled and empowered by modern technologies. And of course, that's the great fear, is that it is someone in their basement creating a weapon of mass destruction, and so on and so forth. Now, what comes quite quickly as part of this discourse is also climate change, and fears about climate change, as well as fears about surveillance, fears about the dark internet, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of hype associated with this. There's a lot of wishful thinking, and then there's a lot of anxieties too. So that's part of this particular discourse, and these are inflated incredibly. So an example would be the Y2K bug. An example would be terrorism and catastrophic terrorism, the terrorist with a weapon of mass destruction, as Masco discusses in his book Theatre of Operations. So that's important to grasp, and it's also important to grasp that there is no longer a return address for the enemy. The enemy is sort of hidden. The enemy is potentially everywhere. And so that heightens the anxiety, inflates the threat, inflates the danger. And so that's part of the geopolitical culture that we are dealing with in this particular instance. Now, there's a large literature on globalization and how to think about it. Porter refers to that in his discussion of the ways in which it can be conceived of on page 3 in terms of extensity, in other words, the stretching of activities, intensity, the intensification of activities, velocity, the acceleration of interactions, and impact, the growing significance of events and decisions in distant places. The resource that I would point you to, and I've taught this in the past, is a set of books that David Held and Anthony McGrew did on global transformations. And there they outline different shapes of globalism and provide a political economy to it. In other words, a description of the particular technological systems that were created at certain times. So they go back to the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and describe the nature of globalization. Then the foreign direct investment of France and others in Russia, and of the United States, in Europe, including Nazi Germany, and so on and so forth. So there you have other globalizations, and they give you a language to begin to understand that. So they have a website which is indicated here. So go take a look at that, because it's got some really good things in it. And if you've got time, you can begin to look at some of this particular literature. Now, what I want to do is discuss some of the concepts that Porter seeks to use. And I have tried to upgrade the particular concepts that he has in the book. He makes a distinction between physical distance and strategic distance, or physical space, strategic space. I don't think this is particularly profound. Physical distance is something that can be overcome by various technical capacities. So in my work in the past, I've looked at described techno-territorial complexes, and what that means essentially is the particular territorial system. And remember, the notion of territory is something that is generated by the state. It is a control effort by the state to try to measure and to grip a particular land and make it into state territory. And so techno-territorial complex would be the ways in which certain technologies facilitate that and also complicate it. So railways facilitating a certain time-space compression, and their significance in the settling of the West in the US, as well as in moving armies in Europe, most significantly before World War I. So you have that dimension, which is physical distance and particular technical capacities. The second dimension is what he calls strategic space. I want to say it's geostrategic, and geostrategic I think has a more specific meaning, and that is how you fight a war. And the geostrategic distance is the ability to project power. He defines it, he's using Derek Gregory's work, but what he cites is actually just a lecture that presumably he attended by Derek Gregory, and rather than any of his subsequent work. So this is page 8, where he writes, I argue that the world is not small. Technology may accelerate movement, enable instant communication, and compress physical space, but it does not necessarily shrink strategic space, the ability to project power across the earth affordably against resistance. By affordably, I mean not just dollars and material sacrifices, but the wider diplomatic practice and the political will to incur the costs. Well, I think it's important to make a distinction between the capacity to project power and what I'm going to call geopolitical distance, and the ability of a particular state to hold a territory and to fulfill its goals, especially when the place is far from it, and then especially when it has limited appeal to the population on the ground. So think of it this way. The United States can and did invade Afghanistan and Iraq, overturned the governments of both, and propped up new governments there. In both cases, that was a power projection capacity which was exercised, but the geopolitical distance of these particular cultures from the United States meant that the soft power appeal of the United States was limited, and the friction of sustaining wars in these particular places was such that over time these particular projects began to fail, and failed quite significantly. So there was important geopolitical distance on the ground. The actual arena was one characterized by fractiousness and a complexity that was in in some instances beyond, in many instances beyond the capacity of US forces and others to make sense of, and certainly to control. So the United States did not have the ability to exercise geopolitical power because of the geopolitical distance. It could exercise a certain geostrategic power, but that had significant and serious limitations. So that, I think, is a way of nuancing further his particular concepts. Now, he sets out the book as an examination of what should be 3 easy cases of globalization. So he examines net war against Al-Qaeda, amphibious war, looking at the case of Taiwan and China. He examines drones and cyber war in one chapter. Those are useful chapters, and you certainly should read those. But what I find most useful about it is his discussion in chapter 1 of globalism as the discourse of liberal hegemony. I don't think he necessarily gets this right completely. I think there's a specificity to the rise of a liberal universalism. That liberal universalism, in one sense, was always part of the civic religious creed of the United States from its founding. But of course, it was supercharged by Wilsonianism and then by the Cold War. His discussion of this is really quite interesting and is kind of useful. As is his outlining of the problems with this globalist creed, if you want to call it that, or you want to call it a liberal hegemonic ideology. So these are the 5 different things that he identifies as problems. What I also found very, very useful is his discussion. It's quite familiar to me, but it is one that I think is very, very, very interesting and requires further research. And that is his discussion in chapter 2 on what he calls the rise of globalism. I would just tweak it a little bit and talk about the spatialities of shock events, the changing sense of vulnerability and distance, the ways in which in a particular historical moment you have the coming together of a geopolitical culture, a geopolitical field, and a geopolitical condition, and then what that does and what that creates. So there's a changing sense of vulnerability and distance with these particular moments. So Pearl Harbor is the moment when American exceptionalism as something which is hemispheric and so-called isolationism is punctured. And when you have a sense that the United States, it creates the injury, which then is the rationale for the United States to begin to confront the Japanese militarily in the Pacific. And it also, because of Hitler's hasty declaration of war against the United States, it created the rationale for the United States to go fight in Europe also. So that's a particular moment, and I think kind of studying the ways in which that operates in the geographies that are created by that moment, and the particular geopolitical cultures, geopolitical imaginations that are swept aside, and the new ones that come in to take over is really worth looking at. There are other moments of sort of punctuation in geopolitical culture that are worth examining too. So the moment of the first Soviet atomic tests and the ways in which that shook the confidence of the United States in its confrontation with the Soviet Union. And that was a difficult contest to try to grasp. The term Cold War was one that emerged to describe it, but what a Cold War was hard to grasp, and it certainly was one that initially by Truman was seen as a righteous fight between slavery and freedom, and of course in in so constituting it that, he constituted in, as I've pointed out elsewhere, in radically ageographic terms. It becomes a moralized story, a religious story. Another example, another moment, is the moment of Sputnik. And the ways in which that shook the self-confidence of the United States too, that it was the home of the most advanced technological civilization. It was at the threshold of modernity. So that's a very interesting moment. And of course then that's the spatial extension of the Cold War to outer space, to beyond the Earth. Then you have 9/11, also as a moment in, analogized as a Pearl Harbor, and another sort of moment of shock in which United States sees itself as vulnerable once again to globalization. And in fact, globalization is declared by some as dead after 9/11. And you have the launching of the global war on terror and the inability or lack of specificity of that. It's global, it's planetary. The threat is everywhere, rather than, okay, we're going after these particular groups who are in these particular spaces. There was a boundlessness to the war, which Porter and lots of other people who were close to the military establishment found very troubling. Now, overall, he describes globalism as a pernicious mentality, and I want to read the summary that he provides in his conclusion, where he describes the geopolitics of hubris. So this is page 217. The global village myth is a pernicious mentality because it can tempt even secure states into self-defeating behavior. Time and again, the American experience of war challenges the assumptions of liberal crusading, demonstrating that it endangers the very values it claims to uphold and loses sight of the limits even on the power and knowledge of the American hegemon. And it forgets that states that suppose themselves the guardians can also be agents of chaos. By deterritorializing the concept of America's security domain, the replacement of large mental maps by small ones has led to the neglect of limits, an insensitivity to strategic cost, a boundless conception of interests, and the pursuit of absolute security at almost any price. By dismissing distance as a force or as a shaping force in world politics, the capacity of America and its allies to think strategically has suffered. Now, this is not a radical critique. He's someone who is, like I mentioned, within the security establishment. But it is, I think, a very important critique and one worth taking very seriously. So I hope you like this book and find it very, very useful. I think it is one that will challenge you to think creatively about our current contemporary condition. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you.